Into it. Introducing myself, I'm Priya Chetty-Rajagopal, and we have our two wonderful authors. We have Mukesh and Dr. Priyank Narayan, both sort of overflowing with management degrees, engineering degrees, and PhDs, giving me a severe sense of inferiority, but let's start anyway. Now, when Mukesh and I go back a long time, and Priyank and I just met recently, but something that sort of just tugged at my interest was Mukesh making a statement on a TV interview sometime a month or so ago, that when his wife Neera wanted to sleep, and I know Neera very well, so I sympathize, but when his wife Neera wanted to sleep, she would take one of his research papers and then just sort of drop off. Now, while that is so mean and presumably funny only by my perspective, the fact is it somewhere defines the way this book has been approached, right? So Mukesh is going to forgive me for this, yeah, and Priyank too. But I want to dive straight into the first question, which is this book, Leapfrog, Six Pillars to Thrive, is a very differently written book in the sense that it is very strongly based on research. So I am highlighting the fact that you have spent a lot of time as academics, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders in research. And you have done a lot of work on that book. But the style of the book is racy, it's quick, it's kind of also adapted to the Instagram generation when digestion of information is in quick, digestible bites. And the fact that you have a very clear path, you have visuals, you have an interesting reading, and you also, which I found very interesting, you have a how-to at the end of the book. You call it the PJM, the personal journey map, which is at the end. So it's perfect for people like us who sort of say, okay, how do you do this? Okay, these are the pillars. And then how do I put it into action? There it is. Now, I make it sound very boring, but the book is actually full of wonderful, wonderful nuggets. And you talk about issues which are grit, nudging yourself, intellectual humility, decluttering, cross-discipline, which I loved, and also thinking entrepreneurially. So these are the different pillars of the book that you've brought together exactly the opposite of way I'm saying it, which is not boring, not repetitive, not just saying it how it is, but with real examples, with real studies. And that's what I want to know a little bit more about. So, and that's what I'm sure all of us want to know about. What's Leapfrog about, and what is this, what made you choose this kind of genre and this style to write? Priyank, you want to start? Oh, Mukesh, you go ahead.
Since I have the mic, I'll make a start.
Yeah.
I'll take a step back as to why we wrote the book. We are both die-hard academics. And what do academics do? They do research. So they write, they publish a paper, it goes through multiple iterations. And at the end of it, after 2 years or 3 years of effort, it gets into a journal. And half a dozen people read it, out of which 5 are your own PhD students. So all these nuggets of information, of research that you have done, stay in journals. And I teach at Ashoka with Priyank, and we used to chat with our students. And they would constantly tell us that, look, all the high-flown research that you do, what value is it? Is it really operationalized? Do people use it? And that's where the idea came up that let's take the research that already exists in the social sciences, in psychology, in anthropology, in sociology, and bring it into a book that is easy to read. The other rule that we thought of when we were writing the book is no gyan, no professorial lectures. So we converted everything into a bunch of stories. Now the stories are short nuggets. We've attempted to be humorous. And at the end of each story, you can take away something from that story that can help you in your journey. Priyank?
I think you've done that, Mukesh, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so I think a lot of our students, and some of them are here in this audience, come back to us when they graduate, and as alums, as recruiters, come back to us and say, you know what, these are the few stories that your students are sharing with us. This is what's worked for them. One of the things that Mukesh teaches at IIM Ahmedabad and Ashoka, and of course I teach at Ashoka University, these are classrooms that are very selective and if I may use the word privileged in some sense of the word. How do we get the learning from these classrooms to a much larger audience? And I think that was also playing at the back of our mind, Priya, as we kind of conceptualized the book and said, let's get the stories out to a much, much larger audience.
I agree, and I agree with both of you that you've done that, and I love the way that this book has come across in a way that you can relate to, and there's some very real lessons, and there's some very real insights in the way the book has been sort of planned. It's a very smart book, and something I think that would help. So thank you for doing that. But I'm going to segue into a question which has been on my mind, and I don't know, I'd love to hear what you think about this. You know, people do write interesting acknowledgements on the fly of their book, and you have written, to the students who teach us every day. It's not an unusual comment, it's not an unusual one, but in the light of your own academic work, your, the kind of research that you've done, the way that you have built on your body of research, teaching, and entrepreneurial journey, there is something to be said for that acknowledgement. So would you like to talk about that?
Sure. No, the book is really an outcome of what we discuss and teach and learn from each other in class. These classrooms are a great lab where ideas actually brew. And so it's not fair for us to say these ideas are ours. They are ideas that have resonated from all the young minds in the classroom. And I think that's why we've dedicated it to them. Mukesh?
At IIM Ahmedabad, we use the case study approach to teaching. So the professor doesn't come and give a lecture. Students read a case, and it could be 25, 30 pages long with exhibits and more information, and they come and discuss the case. So you start off at the case ends. So the contribution that every student makes in the class is the same as the professor makes. I mean, we have 4 or 5 teaching points that we want should emerge after the class is over, and we sometimes gently lead the discussion in that direction. But it's the students who have to teach the case. In fact, famously, if you get into a class and the students have not read the case, you have 2 options. Number 1, give them a quiz test. And the other is just walk out of class and say, if you haven't read the case, there's nothing we can do. Yeah. So we do that all the time, and this to and fro is what makes the case and the class interesting.
And do I have to represent your students for a part of the royalties? just thinking aloud, since we're here in the Berlin Fest. There are some elements of, I wouldn't say contradictions, because it's too extreme a word, but perhaps 2 ends of the continuum, which are reflected in the pillars of your book. Now, you talk about nudging yourself and, and pushing boredom. I mean, learning as a repetitive and important disciplined kind of action. And you also talk about cross-discipline, which is expanding horizons. I'm a great believer in cross-discipline because, my own company, Multiversal, was a product of the fact that I felt that we all can do multiple things and belong to multiple universes. And I'm a great believer in the end, in trying to sort of get more done, and I would be bored stiff if I had to do one thing. There are other elements. I mean, for example, you talk about the focus on getting things done, on thinking entrepreneurially, and there's also the fail fast option, sure. Which is always important for an entrepreneur. Do this, and if you can't win at it, get out. And there's different input you have on failure altogether, which I like. So to address these 2 ends of the continuum and this embracing of different aspects of the of thinking, of provocative thinking in some ways, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think there are a couple of questions there, Priya, and let me try and answer them in some parts. One of the things that we are talking about in the book is embracing boredom and learning to live with boredom, because grit comes with boredom. You have to be able to repeat what you're doing multiple times to become better and better at it. On the other side, we're also talking about doing multiple things, right? And they're not contradictions. They are actually saying you need to have a T-shaped profile where you're known for one thing, but you have the ability to work across multiple disciplines, multiple areas, and have the ability to collaborate with people from different fields. That's what's going to help you be known for that one thing. And to be known for that one thing, it's a lot of hard work. Boredom is something which sports people have to deal with all the time. I mean, you think the cricketer is enjoying playing cricket for 8 to 10 hours in the field? He's also getting bored. She's also getting bored, right? So every expert that you're seeing out there who's known for that field has gotten bored at some point of time with their craft, with what they're doing. And it's first step, accept that. And second is learn to collaborate across other disciplines. Mukesh?
So I'll talk a little bit about failing. And depending on the data that you look at, something like 60 or 70 or 80% of entrepreneurs fail. So the question we ask our students is, and why would you be an entrepreneur? Why would you start a business? And there are various answers students give. But the trick in that question is that the question is wrongly worded. If you look at failure, what you are measuring is the failure of the company, of the startup, of the entity. You're not talking about the failure of the entrepreneur. And I'm willing to bet, I mean, there's no research on this, that when you look at the failure of the entrepreneur, it could be much lower, maybe 10%, 20%. Because entrepreneurs learn from their failure, they pivot, and they do something else. So when we look at these so-called contradictions, Priya, actually there's a lot of basis in it in research that tells you that it's not really a contradiction. That you can be, for example, a liberal arts degree today. You can look at a problem from multiple perspectives. And we talk of wicked problems, which are multi-layered. Now, these are problems that have many dimensions to it. And as you solve one part of it, the problem could actually accentuate. And we look at COVID, for example. It's a wicked problem. You can never solve it. You can learn to live with it. But as you solve one part of it, another part comes up. So this is the way we use liberal arts, we use multiple hats to look at something from multiple perspectives.
Thank you, Mukesh and Priyank, for that one, because that's something that sort of caught my attention when I was reading. I wanted to also cover there are very interesting practices, and I love the way that you have laid out the book as a series of steps, with a very clear path, with a very clear a thought process, bringing it down into milestones, and then a how-to at the end of the book, right? That, I think, is particularly interesting because all of us say, okay, these are very nice intellectual points of discussion and things that we should do, but how does one actually practice that? So that's I think, one of the upsides I really enjoyed about the book. But each of you have, so many different strengths. I mean, you both have, yeah, we are staying alive, actually. But we are also in that position of, constantly engaging with where we are, our workplace, our business, our students. Now, you have brought in different strengths to the book, and I'd really like to know, there are two questions here, how you both came together and why you thought about the book and the title. And a second related question, and I'm putting it together because I do know we have very little time, and I also know that we would like to have one question or two questions if possible. So if anybody's hands are up, you can start now so we can work towards that. Would love to have a question from the audience. And the second question, related to that is, which is your favorite part of the book? I'm not going to jump the gun, but I've heard you talk about intellectual humility. And in these days of bombast where the loudest person gets heard first, and I know it's not as simplistic as that, I wonder. And your space in terms of thinking entrepreneurially is something where, in this context of where India is sort of going fast and furious in the entrepreneurial startup venture space, again, would be very interesting. So two questions here, bundled, in terms of the how and why of the book, and what are your favorite bits of it?
So I'll answer the first part about the title. The title was suggested by Priyank, but the moment he suggested it, he withdrew from it. I loved it. We had a little bit of trouble getting Penguin on board, getting our editor on board, but I kept struggling with that, and then it worked out. Regarding my favorite part, I like the chapter on intellectual humility. It is the ability to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and there's more that we don't know than the amount that we know. So we have used many examples there. We used the example of a robber. Now he reads about lemon juice being an invisible ink. As children, if you put lemon juice in a pen and write, it's not visible till you iron the paper. So he reads about it and says, this is a great idea. So he paints himself with lemon juice and he goes to a bank and he robs the bank. In fact, he waves into the camera because he's so confident that nobody can see him. And by the way, he's not a fool. He has tested this out with a camera at home and the camera film was blank. Well, one professor reads the article because the cops land up at his house within half an hour and say, we've got you here, you are a robber. And the article goes to a professor who says, can we be so stupid that we don't know how stupid we are? And,
We test that theory every day.
and that became a topic of research, and there's a lot of research done on that.
So my favorite part is actually thinking like an entrepreneur. And for every chapter, we've given a subtitle. And the subtitle of this one is called The Audacity of Asking. Okay. So I'm going to read out a very short story from this chapter, which is going to give you an idea of what we mean when we say you should always be asking. In 2019, Satwik Hegde was standing in line to welcome Prime Minister Modi during his visit to Houston, Texas. Over 50,000 people had gathered to see and hear the Indian Prime Minister and the then US President Donald Trump. As the two leaders walked past the children, Satwik stepped forward and asked for a selfie. President Trump agreed. Prime Minister Modi, who had walked a few steps ahead, turned back to join the huddle. Extending his hand, Satwik clicked the most powerful selfie in the world. The expression on the face of the girl next to Satwik told a bigger story. Her eyes widened as her hands covered her mouth. How could Satwik be so audacious? Later in a TV interview, the 13-year-old was nonchalant. He said, "It doesn't really hurt to ask for something you want. Because if you don't ask, the answer is always no." And this is the spirit of working and thinking like an entrepreneur. The world is harsh, but the world is kind. And there are lots of people who are out there to help you. So if you can think like an entrepreneur and always be asking, I think you will get help. And I still believe that there is a lot of humanity out there who will help you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I think the audience resonated with the audacity of asking. And as sort of in context of Mukesh's example, which was the confident idiot. Yeah, because that's sometimes what happens too. So you see what I'm talking about in the way the book has been presented. With the, I see the examples. I see the, for example, cross-discipline is an interesting word, but the subtitle is "When Ideas Have Sex." So you're going to get a lot of people's attention when you say that.
Took the mic away.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually a TED Talk, When Ideas Have Sex. I loved it. I wanted to title the book, When Ideas Have Sex. And my wife said, you do that and you don't come back to this home. But it's a wonderful thought. It's a TED Talk that we have borrowed the chapter title from, where he talks of the interdisciplinary nature of conversations when you come from different perspectives, when you're not sitting in an echo chamber. And I just love that story, which is why in fact, we wanted it in the first chapter, but then we were scared that people would wonder what kind of a book it is. So we had to hide it a little deeper in the book. But I just love that concept, that ideas germinate when they come from different perspectives, which is what a liberal arts education is all about.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no,
No, you
I
go
think
ahead.
we can actually... if
Ask
there
for
are-
questions?
yeah.
Yes, we've got...
Unless
No, I just, one thing which I wanted to ask was, you talk a lot about practice, and there's a difference between what you cover, which I thought was very meaningful to me. There's a 1.00 into the power of, you know, and that little equation that you mentioned, Mukesh and Priyank, between practice and deliberate practice. And I was just wondering when you want to talk about that. And while the answer, do we have hands up in the audience? Whoever has a question, if you could stand up and hang on to the mic.
Yeah.
You have to be nice to the guy with the mic. Yeah. So just, yeah. Okay. The guy with the mic is kind of, you know, I'm just being...
So while the hands go up, and you know, I can see a couple of my students out there as well. Deliberate practice is when you are practicing consciously. It's not mindless repetition. It is not doing the same thing again and again and again. And that's a very fundamental difference that all of us need to understand. To be good at the craft that we want to be, we need to indulge in deliberate practice. It requires you to have a coach and a mentor. It requires you to agree on that fraction of an improvement that you want to do every time. And that's the process that you need to be able to measure as well over a period of time, right? And so if you do that every day, the equation in the book says you can improve yourself 37 times if you're able to improve on even 0.1% of your craft every time you practice.